Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Naomi Wolf, who's going to introduce us to the webinar and get things started.
Thank you so much, Craig Klein. This is Naomi Wolf of DailyClout, and I want to welcome all of you to this really historic webinar. It's the second that Mr. James Ostrowski has honored us with presenting. He did an incredibly well-attended how to file civil charges against especially school officials, but all public officials, including your governor, for misconduct and bad behavior. And that was so important, so impactful. I think it had a measurable impact on current events that we asked him to come back and go to the next level. So he's going to teach people how to file criminal charges, and he's going to walk us through what the crimes are that have been committed, the categories of crimes that have been committed in this pandemic. So truly an historic occasion. We've got hundreds of people signed up. So brief bio. James Ostrowski is a trial and appellate lawyer and a libertarian author from Buffalo, New York. He ran for governor in 1994. He was also part of the at-large committee member of the Libertarian Party of New York, so he walks his talk. He graduated from St. Joseph's Collegiate Institute, has a degree in philosophy from SUNY Buffalo, wow, Brooklyn Law School, and was a member of a great many honorable societies, written a number of scholarly articles, but also popular articles. Very few people do both. His work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Buffalo News, Cleveland Plain Dealer, and Legislative Gazette, and his policy studies have been published by the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, the Ludwig von Mises Institute at Auburn University, and the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. And his work is included in course materials at many colleges, including Brown, Rutgers, and Stanford. So a highly credentialed thought leader. We're thrilled to welcome you. Welcome, James Ostrowski.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be back. So just a little bit about, I'm not by nature a prosecutor. I'm actually a criminal defense lawyer, but in that regard, I do have extensive experience in the criminal law. Also, I have a little bit of an advantage. My late father was a brilliant criminal court judge and a brilliant defense lawyer in his own right, and some of the points that are in the outline, which will be made available after the presentation, are actually based on my conversations with my father. So I'm not a prosecutor, but what has happened in the last 2 years is so evil and so horrible and so horrendous that I thought that it was important to take a look at how we can use the criminal law in addition to the civil law to redress the crimes of the lockdown. So, yes.
Jumping in, I'm sorry. Yeah. Can you turn up your volume or go closer to your mic, please?
Sure.
We don't want to hear the word. Thank you.
Okay.
Lovely.
I hope that's better.
That's better.
Okay. So I think it's important to identify all the perpetrators of this atrocity, identify the crimes, and basically not just so that they can be punished, although that is one of the purposes of the criminal law, so that we can find out what really happened here and identify the underlying causes so this never happens again. And the criminal law is one of the few areas where citizens can actually get involved in the investigative process and have a little bit more control over finding out exactly what happened and what to do about it. So I'm going to try to, there's an extensive outline. I'll try to just summarize it, and then we can get into questions. So one of the things I wanted to point out, well, let me just summarize what we're going to do here, and then I'll get right into it. So we're going to talk about the main categories of crimes, and there's a table of crimes that should be available that were committed during the lockdown. We're going to talk about the agencies that have power to investigate these crimes, the advantages of using the criminal law as opposed to the civil law to investigate the lockdown, although we should do both, how to file a request to investigate, the potential risks of filing a request, because there are some downsides, which we've sort of worked those into our forms to minimize that risk. We'll get into that very quickly. An overview of some of the main criminal statutes that are at play. An overview of potential remedies under international law. And then finally, a proposal for how citizens can take charge of this whole process of investigating these crimes. So we have created a table of crimes, and we'll just go through it very quickly. There's so many, and frankly, I think I've only scratched the surface. I'm sure if I spent another week or two, I could come up with, a number of other statutes. But these are the main crimes. One of my main concerns is the threatening of medical personnel and doctors, and I experienced this myself because I did ivermectin litigation with attorney Ralph Larigo in Buffalo, and I learned a lot, and I thank him for that opportunity. Medical professionals were afraid to prescribe various drugs, including ivermectin and other drugs, and because they were being threatened with disciplinary action. Now, that may be something in the civil law that's a valid process. However, if you look at the crime of coercion under the New York penal law, and basically every state, I'm going to go by New York law, but every state has analogs and very similar statutes. But threatening medical professionals with disciplinary action for making reasonable treatment decisions, that may be coercion under state law. Also, many doctors were threatened for just speaking out, which could also be a violation of their First Amendment rights. We'll get into that a little later. That's actually a crime. The stay-at-home orders, the lockdowns, which caused enormous suffering around the planet, that may be a crime under international law and also U.S. federal law. Applying treatments that are likely to cause death or serious injuries, such as remdesivir, overuse of ventilators, and vaccines themselves, could be, if the facts showed it, a criminally negligent homicide, which is a serious crime and a felony.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not laughing out of happiness, but out of a sense of recognition that, the penalty fits the crime. Forgive me for interrupting.
No, exactly. So deliberately withholding treatments may also be criminally negligent homicide, and that was done. Mask mandates, certainly for children, endangering the welfare of a child, possibly also a violation of their constitutional rights. Vaccine mandates, again, with respect to children, endangering the welfare of a child. Also, potential crime against humanity under international law, which we'll talk about that a little bit later. Falsely reporting COVID statistics, including deaths, could be falsifying business records and also a violation of federal law, as indicated. The citations are in the table, so you don't have to take notes or anything like that. False statements about the efficacy of vaccines and or remdesivir, we know they are legion. They violate 6 or 7 different statutes, which are in the table. False statements about PCR tests, which is something we've heard about and we believe happened. Again, falsifying business records, making false statements related to health. False statements under oath, and we know that a certain gentleman has testified many times, and a lot of us think that person perjured himself. So that's perjury, but also certain unsworn statements. In the Martha Stewart case, you don't have to take an oath to be charged with this. False statements under 18 U.S.C. 1001, which is a statute that's very familiar to lawyers and politicians. So there's so many. Rushing through, I'll talk fast. Suppression of information about or dishonesty about prevention and early treatment. Again, that could be falsifying business records. Suppression of speech on social media by government officials, which we know. I just read RFK Jr.'s finished his book today. He talks about that. That may actually be a violation of federal law, as the citation indicates. Vaccinating children, again, endangering the welfare of a minor. False entries in medical and business records, again, several statutes are violated. So those are your basic statutes. There's probably a few more that other lawyers could come up with, or even the audience itself, if you just start pouring through the penal law or the U.S. Code. So as part 2 is the advantages of the criminal law over the civil law. These are really important. There's no immunity, basically, in the criminal law. There's immunities. They throw us at even the mask lawsuit. We're immune from this and that. The law wasn't clearly established. There's no immunity that I'm aware of for a criminal statute. Now, the big pharma has created all these immunities for themselves, which we all know and dislike. There's no immunity for a criminal violation involving vaccines. There's no a payment of attorney's fees or indemnification. All the lawyers, the people we sued in the mass case, they hired a big firm out of Albany, and their lawyers are paid for. They're paid by the hour. The taxpayers pay the bill. For a criminal, there's nothing like that. There's no indemnification, and they have to pay their own lawyers, and nobody's going to sit in jail for them either. So there's a lot more of accountability. The statute of limitations are longer, and certainly for crimes against humanity, I don't believe there's any statute of limitations, nor should there be. And also, grand juries give citizens direct control over investigations and initiating prosecution. Now, there's a couple downsides, and we've created a form to kind of get around those. The downside of filing a complaint, you have to be accurate, or you yourself could have a rebound prosecution charge, and the political class loves to retaliate. I've written about this in some of my books. So malicious prosecution, you can be, and I sue people for this, so you can be sued if you file a false charge, and that's something you should be concerned about. And also defamation lawsuits. These are all the things that people will retaliate against you against. So in the form that's going to be posted on the website, I've created a request to investigate, which if you follow that, you should not be subject to any of these retaliatory actions. So that's what I've always advised clients to do. Instead of saying so-and-so is guilty, you say, please investigate these following facts and determine if a crime has been committed. You accomplish the same thing, but you reduce your exposure. So there's so many agencies, and they're listed in the outline, which will be published. So go through them very quickly. And what I want to suggest with the various agencies, play them off against each other. Play the sheriff off against the district attorney. Have a little competition in this. Play the FBI against the state police. So in the federal system, you got the Justice Department, U.S. attorneys, the FBI, federal grand jury, and I also point out the the Senate and the House also can investigate, but if it's related to legislation or impeachment. So in the state system, our attorney general is somewhat limited here, but in other states, they have full criminal prosecution. So it depends on the state. The state police can investigate and file charges. The district attorney can file and investigate. The sheriff, there's 62 counties. The district attorney is elected, the sheriff's elected. So they're subject to some, accountability if they don't do something about this massive criminal violation. We can have people run against them. They don't like primaries. They don't like elections. Every town, city, town, village police department, which villages and towns that have a police department, those also can investigate and file any state charges. Something my father taught me years ago, if you go to the police and they don't want to file charges, you can go directly to the warrant clerk in city court or town court and swear out a complaint and try to get the judge to issue a summons. So there's always sort of an end around. And again, we want to use all these agencies. If it's trial and error, if one doesn't want to do it, another wants to do it, we need to exhaust all these options. The grand jury, and this could be another 1-hour webinar, but in theory, the grand jury is independent of the government, but in reality, they're controlled by the district attorney. Until people start to wake up and realize, when you're a grand juror, you're a constitutional official, and you're not subject to, with very limited exceptions, the judge isn't your boss. The district attorney is certainly not your boss. So grand juries need to step up, understand your rights, and you do have the right to initiate investigations and vote indictments, and the district attorney and the U.S. attorney are not your boss, and don't let them push you around. So it's another trick my father taught me years ago. So So there's one final agency that can be a very good investigator for crimes, and that's you. So every citizen can use freedom of information requests, internet searches. You can order if you have if you have a member of your family who died allegedly from COVID, but you know it didn't happen, get those medical records, pore over it, get the death certificate. Any false statement in those records, for whatever reason, designed to get more reimbursement of funding or defraud Medicare or Medicaid, that's a crime. And then you can bring those facts to the appropriate agency. There's a few states, I list them in the outline, where a citizen can actually initiate criminal prosecution: Georgia, Idaho, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. So how to file a complaint? Basically, we've created this template so that you can, again, you make a request to investigate, and the template is listed there. It's a very simple form. There's a few forms on the internet, very few actually, which is kind of a Freudian slip. I don't think these agencies want citizens to participate very much. They want to control everything, and this is what we're pushing against. This is what we're trying to empower people to do, is take control of these mechanisms, because it's our government in theory, and use them to the best of your ability. So that form will sort of immunize you, I believe, from the risk of retaliation and accomplish the same thing. So just a quick discussion about some of the key crimes. I've already talked about how this crime of coercion, because when you scare physicians and doctors away from doing what they, in their heart and in their minds, know is good for patients, what happens? People die. I mean, we have one of the highest excess death rates. I just checked. We are the leading country, large country on earth for per capita deaths from COVID after Brazil. So why do we have all these excess deaths? And JFK Jr. talked about in his book. We kind of know what the theories are. We need to drill down and get to the actual facts. And again, coercion. We can't allow doctors to be bullied, because people are going to die. So that's coercion. Falsifying business records. Look, let me just say that any false statement in an official document, any false statement designed to get government money or to get private money or health insurance, these are all crimes. We know there's thousands, tens of thousands of false statements out there. Every single one of them, if proven, is an actual crime. So falsifying business, the interesting thing about the New York statute is, it's not just making a false statement, it's omitting to make a true entry. And so there's so much of that going on, where they leave out things. It's not just the flat out lie. So I already talked about fraud. We know there's hundreds of thousands of instances of fraud here. We just have to ferret them out and bring them to the attention of the authorities. Criminally negligent homicide. The lockdown killed a lot of people. It's hard to prove that there was intent to kill, because I don't think there was, but there's a lesser standard in the law, and it's described in the statute as basically criminal negligence. So you can prosecute somebody for being responsible for a death without having to prove intent. And let me just say that a lot of these statutes that we're talking about, I would be the first one as a defense lawyer to admit the language is pretty ambiguous. But normally the politicians use these ambiguous statutes against the citizenry. So they're the ones that created these statutes or didn't repeal them when they got into office. There's nothing wrong with using these statutes against the very people who created them when our cause is just. Just federal civil rights violations, very interesting. In the full statutes in the outline, it's 18 U.S.C. 241, 242. It basically criminalizes any intentional constitutional violation. And we know these are massive, and I just used the example in the outline, the suppression of medical free speech by dissidents opposed to the big pharma narrative. It's wrong, it's civilly actionable, but it might actually be a crime. Let's find out. So at the end, I have kind of a long section on international law. I've previously done some research on this. Here's the thing about international law. It's difficult to grasp. It's difficult to understand. The procedures are complicated. The United States is not a party to the treaty, all sorts of obstacles. But the one good thing about the international law, this was an international crime. This had to do, as I pointed out, so one of the studies exaggerating the potential death rate came out of England. The president of the World Health Organization famously and falsely stated the fatality rate was 3.4%. We saw people dropping in the street in China. Mysteriously, that never happened again. So this was an international series of crimes. And so international law has that sort of broader perspective. And some of these crimes, RFK Jr. in his book and my little monograph that I published, the starvation, the disruption, one of the famous authors, I wish I could remember her name, in India, talked about they had 4 hours to lock down and everybody was starving. So it caused this mass movement of people. The forced mass movement of people is always a crime against humanity because the young and the old die and everybody else suffers. The magnitude of this crime, to paraphrase Victor Hugo, calls for something sweeping and conceptually large, like the crime against humanity. Some of these crimes are so big, domestic law doesn't even begin to be equipped to handle them. So that's it. There's a lot about international law for those interested in the outline. I won't go through all the details because I know we need to get into questions. But just one thing about, there's a lot of talk about the Nuremberg Code. What is it? And I just heard a young doctor do a podcast saying, well, the Nuremberg Code isn't legally binding. So, when it comes to mandatory vaccines, as they say in the outline, this is no longer sort of an analogy concerning crimes against humanity. I mean, literally, it is a crime against humanity to force people to undergo medical experiments. And that's in the Nuremberg Code. Now, as I said, the medical establishment wants to tell us that the Nuremberg Code is not legally binding. Well, that would be news to Dr. Karl Brandt, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, Dr. Joachim Rugowski, and Dr. Vladimir Hoven, all of whom were hung by the neck until dead on June 2nd, 1948, for violating the Nuremberg Code. So I think the Nuremberg Code is law. It needs to be reinforced. So finally, just to wrap up some of my thoughts, can we really trust, even though we could take the initiative in a lot of these things, ultimately we're kind of dependent on the political branches of government that have already failed us. So what I'm suggesting, I'm throwing this out for consideration, something like a lockdown truth and reconciliation commission, a well-funded commission to put together a professional staff, have hearings and put together the best research from the best minds and produce a definitive report on the lockdown and name all of its perpetrators, because the truth is the most vicious prosecutor of them all. Is it worth a modest budget to uncover the truth, name the perpetrators, determine the underlying causes, including ideological causes, and propose reforms to make another lockdown virtually impossible? Since the lockdown itself probably caused hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths and several dozen $1 trillion in economic loss, this question answers itself. So we've only scratched the surface. It's a gigantic topic. I've tried to do my best to at least broach the various subjects, issues. We have to get to the bottom of this and make sure this never happens again. Thank you.
Fantastic. I hear virtual cheers from the hundreds and hundreds of people who are watching, and I'm certainly cheering. It's so good to hear the sound of potential justice. I'm sure there are millions of questions. I don't fully see, Craig, where the questions are. So let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, let me jump in with a couple. First of all, Mr. Ostrowski, there's a number of people asking about the concept of the surety bonds that some public officials have to have. Is that an avenue that should be pursued?
I think that's a novel theory. To the extent I've looked at it, I don't see that as a huge potential benefit, but it's a civil proceeding as well. So I'm not particularly fond of that idea, but I haven't studied it in great detail.
And then especially related to what you were talking about with regards to coercing medical officials or medical professionals, who would be the criminal in that case?
The state licensing board. I know that there are agencies that are kind of murky in their organization. I think they'd probably technically be considered private, but the agencies that certify, when people say, oh, I'm a board certified, orthopedic surgeon, these certifying agencies, they also, I believe, sent out threatening letters to people. In fact, I couldn't even get a very sympathetic doctor to sign a vaccine exemption request for a client. So, but the state, they brag about it. The state licensing boards of doctors, they brag about how we send out nasty threatening messages. Well, they might not be bragging too long, because that may be the crime of coercion. Mm-hmm. So whether it's and it doesn't require state action. If you're a private actor, that like the certifying probably a nonprofit private organization that certifies all the various categories of doctors, so they can brag about how they're certified. So yes, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Let's see, the Freedom of Information requests that you mentioned, is that something that can be done at the state and county, city level as well as federal? Or is it only federal?
It's everywhere. It's very easy. My friend Mike Kuzma is an expert in this, FOIL attorney in Buffalo. I do a little bit of myself, but basically you can usually email in a request, state or federal locality. They're all required to respond. They're required to have a list of records. You could start out by saying, hey, what's your list of records? And that way, if you ask for a record, they can't say they don't have it. So ask away. It's easy. It's if you get resistance, it's probably because they're trying to hide something. So this is a very useful avenue for getting documentation. And again, our hypothesis is they lied like a rug during the lockdown. So you get the documents, and the potential crimes will be apparent.
Go
ahead, Naomi.
Thank you. There's a great question. What about the military? Can the military be subject to the legal plans being proposed? And that's from Stephen Alexander.
That's an excellent question. I don't actually know that, but I would think that the military could be subject to civilian courts. I think if it's perhaps a combat situation, they would be subject to military courts, but there has to be jurisdiction somewhere if there's a violation of federal law. I'm not aware of any immunities that the military gets for violating the United States Code.
That's right. That's awesome. So Kimberly Staley, I'm sorry, Craig, go ahead.
That's okay. I was just kind of to follow on to that. There's a few questions about, for instance, if you have not taken the vaccine and perhaps lost your job as a result, right? Who is, do you have standing in filing a criminal charge against, say, the medical board or other officials?
Well, standing is a rather complicated civil concept. It's not so much standing. It's whether you can convince the prosecutorial agency, including a grand jury, that a crime's been committed. So standing would not be your problem. The problem would be convincing the decision maker whether that they should prosecute.
That there's something there.
Yes.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Thank you. So a great question is this for every state? And I believe you said everything
Yes.
varies state by state, correct?
Yeah.
So how can people check the statutes in their state? Isn't there like a URL with all the penal codes state by
Yeah.
state if you search?
It's quite easy to find. So the older states like New York were models for the later states. There's like model penal codes. So there's a tremendous amount of similarity. If there's something illegal in New York, the odds are you're gonna find that it's illegal in Ohio. Coercion is this kind of a cousin of extortion. It might be called extortion in Minnesota, coercion in New York. And really, if you just search for like Minnesota criminal codes, very quickly the search engines will get you to that. And it's all, relatively plain English. You pour through it, you get used to how it's organized, and you can find the relevant statutes.
Thank you so much.
So, Mr. Ostrowski, in the last webinar where we talked about civil charges, one of the sort of recommendations that you made was that, sort of we want to overwhelm them with volume, right?
Yeah.
Is that part of the strategy here too?
Well, I don't want to say that that's the lead strategy, but I think when there's massive crimes committed and a massive number of crimes committed, if the perpetrators start complaining that they're being besieged by complaints, it's like, no, sorry, that you shouldn't have committed all those crimes. I think that let me just say this, that, the old story, we got Capone on taxes, not murder. It's tough to prove murder. It's tough to prove homicide. It's tough to prove crimes against humanity. But it's easy to prove you committed perjury, Dr. Jones, at Congress. It's easy to look at a document that says X and we know X is false. So I think we'll get them on the process crimes, like they often brag that they go after people for. Look for the fraud. Go the low-hanging fruit, to coin a phrase. Look for the false statements. They're almost all criminal. Look for a false statement connected to money. It's usually a felony. So we can find, and I believe if we're all correct about our position on this lockdown, that this crime was facilitated by mendacity and just thousands of lies, the crimes are out there waiting to be discovered and proven.
Right.
And so back to the question about standing, what I'm hearing you say is that in a lot of these cases, the crime was committed through their perjury or through their, inaction or whatever it is. You don't have to be a direct victim of it in order to file the criminal charge, right?
Well, usually it is the victim, but I think any citizen under the First Amendment has the right to call attention to a crime and ask that it be prosecuted by the proper authorities.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Thank you. A lot of questions here from Jackson and Wendy about schools, asking, can you give some examples of how to apply this to schools? Should board members or superintendents be named? And I know you address schools in your civil webinar, but now from a criminal perspective, Wendy asks, are school boards also considered business records in this discussion, like falsifying grades to deny recovery of learning? I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I bet there are a lot of possible falsifications that school administrators are engaged in. And I have one as a stepmom. My stepson's school threatened to double mask children if they didn't wear their masks properly. I think that's child abuse. Yeah. Could I file a charge, criminal complaint?
Yeah, I think any forcing a child to wear a mask is child abuse. I think what you're going to find is, if you can find instances of, in addition to requiring them to wear a mask, the abusive conduct, which you alluded to, harassing children, physically touching them to put the mask back on, you might get into things like harassment, maybe the violation, But again, we're trying to redress the balance here. We've been a punching bag for 2 years. We need to start punching back. I think that there may be crimes concerning, trying to get money because of COVID, any sort of exaggerated facts concerning COVID in any way, shape, or form that are designed to get more school aid. The best thing to do is file those FOIL requests, start pouring over the documents, do crowdsourcing, share it with your neighbors, divide it up. You're going to find some stuff. I guess the worst thing that can happen for us is we find out, wow, all these people were above board. We know that didn't happen. We know this is dirty.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Craig, more questions in your list?
Well, yeah, there's a million of them here. The one question that keeps coming up is, when you file a criminal charge, are there significant costs, assuming that you're not working with a lawyer?
Well, that's the one benefit of the criminal law. The U.S. attorney and the district attorney are paid for by the government, and there's no charge for that. So you don't have to, hire your own attorney. That is one of the benefits. The deficit is you lose some control, which is why I'm suggesting, I think if we can revive the grand jury, that's something that citizens themselves can control just in the initial stages.
So that's the other question with regards to the grand jury. How do you find your grand jury? How do you reach out to them?
That's a good question, because my friend Dave Mangiello is a grand jury activist in this area, and he has tried to contact the foreperson of the grand jury, and boy, they get really upset when you do that. What I suggested in the outline is that that the DA likes to think they own the grand jury. That's how New York works. And really the U.S. attorney, same way. But sometimes you can go through the judge, and if you get a fair and honest judge, which does happen every once in a while, they might forward that request to investigate to the grand jury. But look, we're all, the grand jury of next month may be in this audience. So all the citizens, we need to have grand jury education seminars. We're planning to do that up here in this area, and they should be done around the country. Everybody needs to educate themselves about the grand jury so that when they get called, which they inevitably will, they know that, again, they're in charge, and the district attorney or U.S. attorney is their legal advisor. It's not their boss, and even the judge is not their boss. Scalia said this in a famous decision. I think it was the Williams case. The grand jury is a separate, independent sort of part of the government, but not really, that predates the United States. The grand jury is an incredibly powerful tool, and really, if we make a lot of progress in what we're trying to accomplish here today, it's probably going to be because of the grand juries. We need some runaway grand juries, was the old expression, meaning a good grand jury that's not being led around by the nose by the prosecutor.
Right. Bear Arms asks, what if the magistrate doesn't issue the criminal complaint?
Well, then you have a First Amendment right to criticize that person and let everybody in the community know. And if that person is elected, start to look for, like Buffalo City Court judges are elected every 10 years. And if they don't sign your summons, even though you have good cause, well, the remedy is to not vote for that person and get somebody to, they really don't like to be, have a primary challenge or a general election challenge. So you just have to use the political process.
May I add, before we go back to Craig's question, that we at DailyClout will be delighted to publish any description of a magistrate who refuses to sign a summons. And if you write it up, we'll publish it, and then you can use it to mobilize your community to unseat that person. Over to you, Craig, for more questions.
Let's see here. So let's see, Joyce is asking, can our local health board director who is promoting masks to our local schools as an expert be held accountable?
Well, foil all that person's records. And if they are making false statements about the efficacy of masks, you may have a instance of falsifying business records or omitting the truth or filing a false statement. So you're going to have to do some digging on that and see if you can find facts that meet the definition of that charge, which is listed in the outline that will be made available.
Right. And let's see, Jackie asks, how do we get around exhausting all administrative remedies prior to filing a criminal complaint?
That doesn't apply. That's a civil idea. It's a civil concept. Doesn't apply to criminal law at all.
Okay. So another good reason to go criminal.
There-
They're put in the outline.
There are a bunch of questions about getting medical records, and I know that medical records are being made increasingly difficult to attain sometimes. Juanita asks, my ex-husband died of COVID. I'm so sorry for your loss. In a COVID rehab center, can my children get his medical records without involving stepmother? That's one question. And another woman said that her sister, who is a nurse, is preventing her from getting her medical records.
Mhm.
Don't people have a legal right to their own medical records? I mean, a record, if something bad was done to you, that's evidence of a crime, right? Potentially? You need a
Yes.
medical record?
Yes. A living, competent person can get their records if the person is deceased. There's some gray area there. If the person has an executor or administrator of their estate, they might be able to crowd out the children. All you can do is try in that particular state and see. There's nothing wrong with filing a request for it, and if you never know what a hospital is going to do. I can't say I know the exact parameters of who can get records after a person is deceased, other than the spouse, I'm certain, and the executor, the legal representative of the estate.
But you can always get your own medical records, right?
Yes.
So what if the hospital says, if we don't have them, sorry, what can
Well,
you do?
I've never seen that happen. They will produce records unless they claim that you're not eligible to get those records.
Right. Can I ask a big picture kind of question for a moment before we go over to more questions? I loved, my favorite part of this webinar, it's all wonderful, but when you were talking about the different crimes, I mean, I'm literally going to screenshot that and send it all over the internet. What are some of the penalties if people are found guilty, for instance, of fraud or falsifying business records? How long might someone be in prison? Are there fines? Like what are the possible outcomes if people are successful in filing criminal complaints?
Well, some of these things are quite serious, like criminally negligent homicide, obviously. What I did with the process crimes, I usually listed the misdemeanor level, which is sort of easiest to prove. There's usually felony versions of the misdemeanor offenses that have additional sort of serious elements of the crime. So basically a misdemeanor in New York, in theory, could get you a year in jail. But I think that it's more of I think the actual punishment is somebody in some formerly respectable person is now accused of falsifying or doing something that got some money improperly. And really for a lot of people, the actual charge itself is the horrifying thing, having to go through the court process, and the penalty is almost like secondary. But many of these crimes involve, they're going to have to hire their own lawyer, as I already pointed out, negative publicity, but there is actually jail time at the end of almost every crime listed in there. And, in federal criminal law, they really don't mess around. And very often, even a first offense can get you jail time in some very unpleasant institution.
Right. Thank you so much. And what about for like mass negligent homicide? Like if Rochelle Walensky or Anthony Fauci were saying things they knew to be untrue that caused a lot of people to die or get seriously injured, with these mRNA vaccines, for instance, isn't that some kind of grand scale of negligent homicide? I mean, what is that crime even?
Well, we're in I think it's a crime against humanity. And this is the point that I was trying to explain before, where the crimes are so gigantic that the domestic law is not even designed to deal with them. I mean, if some estimates are correct, we have hundreds of thousands of excess deaths, either due to a variety of different causes, as RFK Jr. talks about in his book, I talked about in my monograph. Really think that it's time to resort to international law. It's time to maybe have, as I suggested, our own sort of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because domestic law is not even designed to deal with crimes of that magnitude.
Wow. Thank you so much. Over to you, Craig.
Well, I'm going to start with Jane's question. She's asking, do we employees of a district school system have a legal way to stop weekly PCR testing?
Well, I think, again, that's more of a civil law question. Filing a lawsuit. I think that the way maybe to stop PCR testing may be by trying to find out if there's been a lot of false statements that have encouraged people to do the testing, and that we may be able to get them that way. But other than that, I mean, unfortunately, there haven't been that many lawyers involved in fighting the lockdown. There's a couple dozen around the country. There's a shortage of lawyers. I'm besieged by calls. I try to help people, but you may have to just file a civil lawsuit or try to work through FOIL requests, try to convince people that there's no reason to have these tests.
There's a lot of people in the chat that want former Governor Cuomo to be on the list. And the question that's been asked several times is putting COVID patients in nursing homes a criminal crime?
Great question.
I was mindful of that. It did not end up in my outline. However, I think that definitely should be investigated. But another thing that I understand Governor Cuomo did, and I sued him over the lockdown, but I wasn't aware that he issued an order barring the use of hydroxychloroquine. Well, I was able to pronounce that. Wow. As a early treatment for COVID. And I was flabbergasted. It's like, what are you talking about? So to me, that in addition to what he did with the nursing homes, which we all sort of know, but so far know, what we need to do on the nursing homes, we need to get a runaway grand jury, because obviously the prosecutors don't want to touch this. The U.S. attorneys don't want to touch it. The DAs don't want to touch it. But we need some grand jurors to step forward and say, we're voting to investigate this. We want to start subpoenaing witnesses. Let's get some gigantic document requests by subpoena in here. That can only be remedied through the grand jury. But what he did on I can't even pronounce it anymore. I was flabbergasted by that. I didn't even know it happened. I believe I read it in RFK Jr.'s. I did read it in RFK Jr.'s book.
So there's a few more people asking. You answered this question earlier, but maybe they joined late, about
Sure.
Sort of who's the criminal that we're filing charges against in all these cases.
Well, it depends on what the crime is, but we're talking about various public officials. We're talking about doctors. We're talking about state licensing medical boards, hospital administrators. We have hospital administrators issuing orders to medical doctors: don't do this, don't do that, don't do ivermectin, use remdesivir, maybe because remdesivir got some extra financial incentive to use it. Why are hospital administrators ordering doctors around? Again, that could be the crime of coercion. So it really just depends. Whoever filed a false statement, obviously they're the criminal. Whoever perjured himself. I think there's thousands of these things. So I think we're going to find that there's no shortage of perpetrators.
Christine Tivnan asks, and I want to know this too, who would be the criminal for universities mandating the vax and the booster? All those millions of young adults. Who's the criminal?
Good question. Whoever issued that order, whoever issued that order. I mean, it needs to be. Look, again, we're in uncharted territory here. I think a lot of these people are going to be flabbergasted when they hear about this webinar. But you know what? The statutes are on the books. If the shoe fits, wear it. We need to investigate factually. We need to look at the statutes and make sure that we're using them in the right way. But whoever's issuing these orders, which is leading people to either get an unwanted medical procedure or leave the college, look, if any of these people committed crimes, I have no sympathy for them. We've all suffered through this for 2 years, particularly the young people. And I have 2 children, and they both, with the rest of the people in our family, have all suffered through this. So let's go for it. Let's see what we can pin on these people.
Really good question just came up, and it scrolled out of my way before I was able to catch the name of the person that asked it. But for instance, Medicare is paying, reimbursing much higher rates for remdesivir, right? So
yes.
Is that a form of coercion?
I think the way to look at it is to study why they are reimbursing it, and that must be based on some documentation from big pharma. I forget the company that does that. It's on the tip of my tongue. But there's obviously people have been snowed by other people. People have lied in order to separate the taxpayer from their money. So I think the way to look at it is to find out what false statements were made by whom, with the result that extra money, because in theory, there's nothing really wrong. If, let's say there was a miracle drug, and I don't think that people would complain that Medicare was giving extra money, or a drug that was very useful but really expensive. It's just that remdesivir is not that drug, is my understanding anyway. So we need to find out what the paperwork was that led to this decision, and if our suspicions are correct, there's going to be some there may be some false statements in there.
So it's kind of what I'm hearing you say as a non-attorney, it's a matter of connecting the dots. A lot of times you're going to start with a FOIA request and to get the information, and then you're going to follow that down the train, and there may be another FOIA request, and you're just connecting the dots.
I mean, you're not going to get a public official for like a discretionary act of spending, but if the documentation that was presented to them misled them, then that could be a crime.
2 questions about withholding medical treatment. William said, my doctor said he'd refuse to treat me if I had COVID. What of that? And Leah said, denied Achilles tendonitis physical therapy and foot surgery because I cannot wear a mask. Are people committing crimes by denying medical treatment?
Well, unless it led to some very severe consequence, I would say that's more of a civil matter, either of a complaint against them for their medical license or possibly medical malpractice. But fortunately, and it sounds like in those instances, the person did not, suffer a serious injury or death. So unfortunately, or fortunately, the criminal law really is there to remedy serious, consequences for the illegal act.
Thank you so much. Craig, are there more questions?
Let's see. Nadine is asking, she says, the college I teach at wants me to submit my health records and include the booster, and she's teaching online. So, is there a strategy for her there that, I don't know what it would be.
Well, it sounds like in that circumstance, your remedy is more of the civil lawsuits that we talked about in the prior webinar. But again, if you can, if it's a public university, you can do some foiling around for documentation. maybe the university has gotten false information from a third party, and that may be the criminal aspect of that situation.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of questions, which are really important questions that are pretty oriented towards civil actions. And I encourage everyone to also watch the earlier webinar that Mr. Ostrowski taught about filing civil action. And what I'm going to ask, because I didn't know the difference till someone explained it to me, I'm going to ask Mr. Ostrowski to write up a brief description of the difference between civil and criminal law, or direct us to a good link so we can keep it in mind. Question for you, Mr. Ostrowski, from me. A lot of women's health harms were criminal offenses like forced sterilization, forced abortion. These have been, adjudicated. Isn't forcing a vaccine, for instance, akin to some other kinds of, and I think these are like battery or, forcible restraint or things like that? Aren't there precedents in kind of invasive treatment of women's bodies, for instance, that could be used to bring criminal charges for, forcibly injecting someone, for instance, against their will?
Yeah, that's worth exploring. That you raise an interesting point. I think that's what's happening is that people are being sort of coerced into this, not by physical force, which I think definitely would be a crime, but they're being sort of indirectly coerced. You'll lose your job or you'll have to leave the college. So I don't know if that's the right analogy, but again, with respect to kids and masks, any sort of physical force that was used there may actually be criminal.
Fantastic. Thank you. Craig, more questions over there?
Oh yeah, there are lots of them. Let's see. There's a few acronyms here that I'm not familiar with, so let me just throw them out there for you, Mr. Ostrowski.
Sure.
How does the PREP Act affect criminality? Are you familiar with that one?
PREP. I can't say I'm familiar with that, so you got me.
Okay.
Me either. I guess we have time for one more question, right? And then a kind of thank you and next steps. Do you want to choose the final question, Craig?
No, go ahead if you got one.
Well, this is good. These are heartbreaking. Lisa says, how should citizens proceed to stop mandates when we can't get an attorney? And I think you kind of answered that on the criminal level a bunch of different ways. But Lisa, I'd refer you to the civil webinar. Was there something you wanted to add to that, Mr. Ostrowski?
No, I think we need to exhaust all possibilities, lawsuits, criminal procedure, our own study commission, until we find out why this happened and make sure it never happens again. It's not going to be any one tactic. It's like, it's like in the military, you have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Special Forces. We need to do all those things. We need to do everything we possibly can to fight back and stop being a punching bag and start punching the bad guys for a change.
Wonderful words to end on, wonderful thoughts to end on. We've had almost 700 people listening now, and hopefully millions more will listen after this goes out online. Do you want to say where you can be reached, Mr. Ostrowski, or do you not?
No, everybody knows where I am. I've got no secrets. I'm on Twitter and Facebook. You can. I'm in Buffalo, New York. The best way, if you have a legal question, please text me, because I can't always pick up the phone, or send me an email. That stuff's pretty. My contact information's on my website, which is listed, Liberty Movement, my political website, libertymovement.org. But my contact information's on there for legal purposes too.
We can't thank you enough. And I just want to remind everyone that we rely on everyone's donations and memberships for support in order to keep our doors open, keep our staff turning out all of this important independent information and news. And so please keep supporting DailyClout. If you haven't supported DailyClout, please go to DailyClout. And we are so honored with Mr. Ostrowski's presence, and this being the second in his webinars. Come back anytime, next time a grand jury discussion if you like, or whatever you think people need to know. And Craig, are there any final thoughts you want to share with our audience?
Well, I'll echo your sentiments. Thank you very much, Mr. Ostrowski. This has been tremendous. And yes, let's do this more. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's very empowering. For the audience, I put a link in the chat just a minute ago to the blog post on the DailyClout site, where you can download all the materials that Mr. Ostrowski has put together, including the outline, some sample criminal complaints, information requests, and other things. And you can see there's some other links to different resources that he provided that are also in that same blog post. So go get all that stuff, share it with your friends. And tomorrow, everyone will get an email that has a link to that blog post and the recording of the webinar. So if you had technical difficulties, or you want to share the webinar with anyone, you'll get that tomorrow.
We can't thank you, Craig. We cannot thank you enough, Mr. Ostrowski. You're a real patriot, a real hero, and you've empowered hundreds and hundreds of people tonight. So multi-front offensive, let's go get them. Thank you so much, and thank you all.
Doing this is very important.
Thanks,
Thank
James.
you so much. Bye-bye. Hey, everyone. It's Naomi Wolf of DailyClout, and I am asking you to please, if you like the video you just saw, support us, become a member, donate. You can send checks to P.O. Box 24, Millerton, New York, 12546, or go to DailyClout, DailyClout, become a member or donate. Thank you so much for your support. Every penny goes for paying our hardworking staff, paying hosting costs, and paying our lawyers who have been leading the fight to keep you safe and free, to keep the Constitution safe and to keep you free. Thank you so much.